All right, everybody, welcome back. If you are just tuning in and you're watching these to study for the Unit 4 Quiz 2, make sure that you watch the previous 3 videos first because otherwise the chronology is going to be very confusing for you. So let's talk. The previous video, remember, we left off with the Camp David talks. Let's talk about the Second Intifada. I don't want you to be too overwhelmed by all the text on this slide. I'll try to break down the very important elements and the elements that are more important just to understand the broad context. So let's start with the broad context, shall we? Actually, I want to make an additional point beyond just what this says. It says the long-term cause is tensions as a result of the failed 2000 Camp David summit. Well, first of all, I would take issue with the fact that that's not so long-term because the Intifada breaks out immediately after the the Camp David talks end. I would argue that the long-term cause is really high tension as a result of not not necessarily failed peace talks, but potentially peace talks that seemed like a step forward that ended up not really resolving any major issues. And if you don't know what I mean, then go back to the previous videos and then you'll get what I mean. You could ask yourself, to what extent was the Camp David Accords of 1978 a deal that actually resulted in some progress towards peace? Develop a little thesis statement about all these other peace talks that we talked about going into this video. All right, but moving forward, the immediate cause it's important to know, but we really just what this says is all you really need to understand, right? That the Prime Minister, Ariel Sharon, or rather the person running for Prime Minister at the time, Ariel Sharon, goes to the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, but he's escorted by thousands of Israeli soldiers. And so Palestinians are upset because they feel threatened. Remember that this is the mosque that is right next to the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem. So they're worried that if this is a sign of things to come, that they may lose access to that mosque entirely. So they're afraid, but some of them are also angry. And so the Intifada starts when Palestinians see people praying at the Wailing Wall and they're upset and they start hurling stones at them. And that starts the Intifada. So it starts not it starts for similar reasons, but the course is much more violent. It's interesting to think about that because the Second Intifada went on for roughly the same amount of time as the first. And so that first tells you how important the rise of Hamas is in terms of making it more difficult to achieve peace because there is more Hamas activity in the Second Intifada, particularly suicide bombing. And not just Hamas, there are other parties, but we just didn't get into them. Islamic Jihad is another one. This means that the Israeli response is also going to be violent, and the casualties are 4 times higher than they were in the First Intifada. Uh, so, like the First Intifada, the majority of the casualties were Palestinian. But if you think about, I forget exactly how many Israelis died in the First Intifada, and forgive me, I'm not going to go back. I don't want to make these videos too long. But this is a much higher. I want to say that this was like quadrupling the Israeli death toll alone and potentially tripling the Palestinian death toll. And forgive me if I'm wrong. Go back to the previous video that discussed the First Intifada, or I could go back at the end. Additionally, um, the consequences are much more dramatic in terms of limiting the prospects for a successful peace process. The first one was that the wall starts going up around the West Bank. And then, of course, as we said in the video before this, the Likud party, ever since the late 1990s, is the strongest political party, rather, in the Israeli government, their Knesset, their parliament. So that means that it's been increasingly difficult to have negotiations between the Israeli and Palestinian governments. Um, so that is one of the major reasons why this is so difficult. Another thing that's interesting to consider, we didn't talk about this in class, but we talked a little bit about the role of George W. Bush in other examples in class, but it's interesting to know rather that George W. Bush supported the Israeli government in responding quite strongly militarily to the Second Intifada, And that partially is because look at the timeline. Before the Second Intifada ended, the United States was well into its war on terror. So they see this as an extension of that. Then we did, these are just images of the wall. You could pause and take a look and think about your observations. This is a Palestinian town on one side, Israeli settlements on the other. It's really interesting to zoom in here. This was the green line, the 1949 armistice line between Israel and the West Bank, which was controlled by Jordan at the time. And this red line shows you where the wall is. And then this one also, just bear in mind that this is a little old at this point, but this shows you another view, a much more zoomed out view of the entire West Bank. That's this one on the left is obviously just the Jerusalem area. Okay, let's finish with this. Okay, more images of the separation barrier. It's also a fence in different areas. You could read the captions. We did an activity on this. And for those of you who are watching who I don't teach, I did tell my students that I did grab these photos from someone else's photo essay, and I realized in retrospect that almost all of them are from the Palestinian side. And I think if I had a little bit more time to add to this in future years in the classroom, I would definitely include more photos from the Israeli side. But there is one. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more, just final slides here before the quiz. And then, of course, as always, ask me questions. Come by for extra help, leave comments, send emails, anything. But these are good questions to make sure you can answer as you review. And here we go. So to answer the first question, were there any other attempts at peace after the Camp David talks, and how successful were they? This is what this slide is talking about. So the Arab peace plan or Arab League rather, peace plan of 2002 is interesting because you see that this is the Arab League's attempt at a peace deal. As you remember, the other peace deals that we've discussed, the US seems to be at the center, literally, if you think about all the images, the center of the negotiations. So the 2002 Arab peace plan shows that these countries in the Middle East that are much closer to the conflict feel that it is their obligation to come up with their own version of a peace deal. It's also important to realize that this is post 9/11, so at this point in history, the Middle East, not the entire Middle East, but the Arab nations in the Middle East look to the U.S. with distrust. So they also want to have their own version of the peace plan for those reasons. So basically, it's exactly as written. Again, this is a text-heavy slide. Forgive me for that. But first off, they argued for the Israeli military to withdraw from all of the territories that it had occupied since the 1967 Six-Day War. So if you remember all of those territories, that would include the Golan Heights, that was Syria, the West Bank, of course, the Gaza Strip, and as you know, that by 2002, the Sinai Peninsula had been returned to Egypt. So that would include, obviously, all of the settlements. And also, it called for the declaration of an independent Palestinian state that had Jerusalem in the capital. So that, of course, is complicated, especially if you consider the red lines. This would not be something that, especially a Likud-controlled Israeli government, would accept. And then also it called for a just settlement of the refugee problem, but they do not spell out, or rather, as you recall, that was another one of Barak's red lines. So it doesn't seem likely that his successor would agree to that either. It does not specifically call for the right of return, but some imply that that's what that means. Mahmoud Abbas, who was the new president of the Palestinian Authority, which we already talked about, this new government created after the Oslo Accords, thought it was an acceptable plan, but the Israeli Prime Minister at the time, Ariel Sharon, rejected it. So that plan did not work. And then in the same year, you have another attempt that was largely from a Western perspective, the roadmap, and it was created by the Quartet. It's called the Quartet because there were four parties involved: the United States, Great Britain, Russia, and the United Nations. So really the only non-Western voice in that quartet was states within the United Nations that were on that committee. So you can see that in some ways these are sort of opposing peace plans. But the Quartet roadmap, it calls for a two-state solution. We talked about that a lot in class, and we'll focus much more on what that means in our presentations at the end of this unit. But essentially, what a two-state solution would likely look like would be the territories that Palestinians lived in would become some sort of Palestine, and then Israel would remain Israel. But the problem, of course, the complications with that are the existence of settlements. Another problem is that Gaza and the West Bank do not border one another, so that would make a unified Palestine difficult. And Israel also, in the roadmap, had another list of reservations. Not exactly red lines, but one of the things that they said was they didn't want Jerusalem to be split into an east and west, and they also were not willing to accept the right of return because that would involve returning land to Palestinians that had been built up by Israelis. Realized that the population of Israel had grown quite a bit since the 1948-1949 war. So, and a lot of those Palestinian villages that had been evacuated and destroyed, those had been built over by Israelis. So that would have been really difficult for the Israeli government to pull off. So that's one of the reasons why these plans also do not work, and also the primary reason why these plans fizzle out is because the Second Intifada was well underway by 2002, and so it was really difficult to talk about peace when so much violence was happening right there. So, and then the last failed peace attempts, and these happened toward the tail end of the timeline that we need to know, right? The secret Abbas-Olmert meetings. Abbas, again, the president of the Palestinian Authority, and Ehud Olmert, who was the Israeli prime minister at that point. So they met in secret, which is really interesting. One could say that they had learned their lesson from other peace talks in the past. But they were unwilling to agree on the issue of the Israeli annexation on the West Bank, the settlements in the West Bank. And ultimately, there was an Israeli invasion of Gaza. And then after that was all finished, the prime minister at that point, Benjamin Netanyahu, did not resume peace talks. Okay, so we looked at images of the wall already, but this is just a slide that summarizes some interesting and important features. So it is, like I said, it's made of different material depending on what part of the border we're looking at. In areas close to Jerusalem, obviously, the security is much higher. A lot of those portions of the fence have barbed wire and electricity, and also watchtowers. We already talked in the previous video about how it runs to the east of the Green Line, and that's because there are settlements to the east of the Green Line, so they wanted to include those there. They also have a buffer zone, a seam zone, or sort of a demilitarized zone in between the wall and any sort of settlement people living there, and that included about almost 10% of the West Bank. So that gives you a sense of why the narrative or the perspective of this separation barrier is so different. So the Israeli government put it up because of the violence of the Second Intifada, and they wanted to defend the Israeli people. But the Palestinians saw this as an increasing sign of the loss of their land, and they felt increasingly hopeless that it would never be possible for them to have their own state. So they reacted to this with a sense of despair, and they saw it as tantamount to apartheid. So they called it the apartheid wall. So also, I forgot to say the Israelis, the government will call it the safety fence. So there's different terms for the fence even, which also gives you a sense of how it is seen from different perspectives. Okay, just another interesting map here. I would check out the key. It's really interesting to look at the different views of the wall here. And then let's finish it up. So let's talk about what happens in 2006 to the Palestinian Authority's governments and why that's going to make the potential for peace even more complicated. So definitely check out this video. I'm going to make a shortened version of the slides. I'm just going to take all the content, put it all in one smaller slideshow and share that with you so you can Control F search things. So it's not going to be on slide 160 for when you have access to the slides, but just do a Control F search for that and check out that video because it's really, really helpful and it will help you answer these questions. But I'm going to try to answer these questions with the content on this next slide. So the next slide is about Gaza, but this is going to answer these questions, okay? So we ended the content going into this quiz talking about the humanitarian situation in Gaza. So it's important for you to consider just literal size for comparison. I know you guys are in California, so some of you may not have been to New York before. I wish offhand I knew exactly how big. This, of course, includes part of the Hudson River, right? I mean, this is a lot of water here, but Gaza is a very, very small area, but it's very densely populated. And even though 1.8 million people, there's 8 million people that live in New York, at the same time, the infrastructure in Gaza is not equipped to handle that many people in such a small space. So the Israeli government withdrew from the Gaza Strip in 2005. And when they did that, they closed off the Gaza Strip with another wall. And the wall was very close to the Green Line border. So that was a little different from the separation barrier that we just talked about. Now, the border is really difficult to cross at this point. If I'm correct, I think the border between the Gaza Strip and Egypt is permanently, or it's closed completely. You can't cross that border. There is a way to cross into Israel, but it's strictly regulated. And then the next year, the Palestinian Legislative Council decides it holds democratic elections, and Hamas wins the majority of the seats in their legislative council. And Fatah won the second most number of seats, and these two factions, these two parties, were at odds with one another. And Hamas and Fatah actually were fighting one another in Gaza, and eventually Fatah left the Gaza Strip entirely and retreated to the West Bank. So at this point, since 2006, Hamas has been the ruler of the Gaza Strip. And the reason why that's really problematic, well, first off, as you see here, that many world powers see Hamas as a terrorist organization, not really a government. And the other reason why that's really difficult is that makes it much more difficult for Palestinians to be able to achieve any sort of statehood. They aren't getting they aren't collaborating. They're geographically separated. So that makes it that much harder for there to be any possible Palestine in the future. Furthermore, as we already know, they support terrorism as a tactic. So of course Israel doesn't want to negotiate, saying, we don't negotiate with terrorists. So the thing that makes that really unfortunate is that Gaza is full of innocent civilians that don't have the sort of access to basic resources to live a healthy, productive life. And part of that is also because the reaction to the Hamas victory in the elections was a blockade of Gaza. So since no goods could get in and out at all, remember that they were regulated prior to that, that means that they have a shortage of resources. So it's not only, Hamas was in some ways, right, they rose to power democratically. People voted for them. It wasn't just that they used violence, but ultimately, because of this blockade, this place is in such despair that there's so much anger in this region, specifically anger toward Israel, that only makes the situation worse. So I feel like this video has gotten long, so let's wrap this up here.